Hello guys, welcome to my YouTube channel Learn to Code with New. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year in advance to you all. So, welcome to our Typescript series episode number 6. So, in the last video we actually discussed about type inference. When I'm saying my last video, it's basically episode number 5. So this is episode number 6. So in my last video we basically discussed about type inferences and any type and unknown type in TypeScript, and what is the power of unknown type as compared to any type. So today we will be learning uh, other things about type, and in episode 6 so there is another powerful thing in TypeScript in which you can basically define a variable as a multi-type. So let's dive right in. So for example, you have a variable b, and for some reason there is an API specification which basically says this variable b can have a value as a number, or it can have a value as a boolean. So it is a variable which can have a value of number and have a value of boolean. So you can define it as this, like as a multi-type in TypeScript. You can actually also define it as this, like with a pipe symbol, like number, boolean, or string. So you can have a variable which is a number, boolean, and a string. And obviously in a variable you can have one value at a time. So if you are saying it is 1, so b is right now b value is 1, and if b is true, the b value is true, and if b is something as a string, b value is as a string. So so this is the thing with multi-type. So a simple example can be, so for example, there is a you want to define a type of WhatsApp message which can be a string and it can be a boolean. So a WhatsApp message can have a string which is an actual message, right? And it can have a status of the message, that the message is delivered or the message is not delivered. Like this is like a very vague example, but let's say if you want to do that, so you can have a b variable in which you can at one point of time you send the value as hello. So from the server you are getting the value as hello and you are showing it to the UI, and at the next event you get the value as true, which basically says that this message has been sent to the sender. So this is one of the things which you can do in TypeScript. But you might have a question that what if I just, like, rather than just doing this, I will just do this, right? I can actually do this. So b1, let's say, and then I can put any value in it. Like I can put string, I can put this, and I can put number. So sorry, this is a b1. So you kind of know what I actually mean. So I can put anything in it. That is correct, but the main disadvantage of this is, like, what if the API spec just says that this b1 variable has to be a string or a boolean, it can't be a number. So any doesn't make sure that it can't be a number, right? So over here we are actually making sure that this b can't be a number, right? And the other thing is, over here you actually, in the Visual Studio Code, you get a benefit of intelligence. So if you have defined a type of a variable, you can just say b dot, and if the last value was written as a boolean, your Visual Studio Code will actually show you a method of the boolean type, which is value of. That is one of the method. So let's say if the last value is a string, then you type dot, you will see all of the string methods. So this is one of the other benefit of using a type, like strictly defining types. Whereas in any case, you can't do that if you define dot, like TypeScript doesn't know what type it is, right? So this is one of the benefit, and one of the things you can do with types, you just can define multi types of the variable. All right, so moving on to my next topic, which is functions. So what are functions in TypeScript and how we define the functions in TypeScript? So all of you who are familiar with other programming languages, so function is basically a routine in which you basically define a set of instructions, and you can reuse that routine anywhere in the program. So reusability is the most important thing for functions. So in short, that is the definition. But how you define a function in TypeScript? So a simple function, let's say a function of a sum or add, you can define it like this, and you can pass in the parameters num1, num2, and then you can basically say, okay, if you want to add num1, num2, there you go. So here num1 and num2, if you see in the Visual Studio Code, there are 3 dots below there. So what that means is TypeScript is inferencing. So here the type inferencing is working, or it's coming into the play in parameters. So what I mean by that is, so if I say console.log, let's just call this function, you can call this function by add, and in the parameters, if you define 1, 2, it will spit out a number of 1 plus 2, 3. But here TypeScript is automatically type inferencing that num1 and num2 will be numbers. So if we say node main, and it is 3, which is correct. But if I do this, TypeScript will not complain again, right? So if I run this program, it will be 1 plus 2, and it will be 1 plus 2. So here concatenation is coming into play because TypeScript is recognizing this num1 is a string. So it basically concatenates it. So 1 plus 2, and it returns 12, right? So in order to make sure that this num1 and num2 both should be numbers, we can, in the same way how we do it in variables, you can actually define the type of the parameters by just doing this. So now if you see, TypeScript is complaining that it can't take num1 as a string parameter. Okay, so now these are like basic functions and how you can define a parameter type. So comes handy because in JavaScript you just can't do it. You just have to just make a check before this that is if number is a type, if num1 is a type of number, and if num2 is a type of number, then accept it, otherwise throw some error or something. So TypeScript is very handy in these kind of things. So now moving on to the other things, which are optional parameters and default. So what are optional parameters? So for example, if I write a function, again there is a function which basically says if num1, then if num2 is there, right, then I want to return this whole thing, right? I want to return it, and else I will just return num1, right? Suppose here is my function. So over here I'm basically saying if num2 has a value, or it's present, or if it's truthy, then I will just return it num1 plus num2, otherwise it will be num1, whatever the value of num1 is, right? But here if you see, I have to define both of the parameters. If I define only one parameter, it will complain, because it will just complain that both num1 and num2 are required. But what if I want to do that, hey, num2 is not actually required, I want to make it optional. So what I can do is I will just add a question mark and it will solve that thing. So then TypeScript doesn't complain about it, and if you run it, it will just print 1, because that was the value of num1, right? And num2, we didn't define any value, so what will be the value of num2 in this case will be undefined, which is a falsy value, right? So obviously this line of code will not get hit, and this will get hit, right? Okay, so now what happens, what if I want to say, okay, if user doesn't give me a value of num2, I will by default I will assume that the value is 10, let's say. So what I can do is, you can actually have a default value of a number, of a parameter. So if I want to do that, so let's say I want to add a value as default, then obviously there is no point in defining this num2 parameter as optional, because it is not optional now. So what basically this means is, if over here I don't define a value of num2, I don't actually give up or pass a value of num2, this function will assume the num2 value will be 10, right? So in either case, regardless of if I define the value, or sorry, if I pass a value or not, there will be always be a value in num2. So over here now the value should be 11, because I haven't passed a value over here. It assumes this function will automatically, the num2 parameter will be assigned to 10, and 1 plus 10 is 11, right? And if I pass in the value, let's say 2, then this value will be assigned to this num2. So now you will see the answer is 3. So I actually forgot, there is a gotcha in the optional parameters, right? So the gotcha is, so for example, if you are defining this as a optional, right, and you haven't passed a value, let's say the case of optional, right? So you can't actually define a required parameter after that. So for example, you can't just say num3 as a number, like you can't do that. If you have to define optional parameters, they have to be the last parameter. So for example, you have to change the order of num3, so num3 will have to be over here, and then you can define num2, right? So why this guy is complaining now, because the function says you have to have these two things as required. That's why it was complaining. So that's the gotcha which you have to take care of. So but you can always define all the optional. So after the optional, you can't define a required parameter. That's the rule, right? But you can define more optional parameters. As simple as that. So yeah, so these were some of the gotchas and some of the good things about TypeScript. So so default parameters and optional parameters. Alright guys, so let's jump onto the new concept, or I can say a new type, which is a object. So why we need an object type? Okay, so if you see in TypeScript, we have like total like 2 or 3 types, right? uh, you can say 5 types if you want. So you can define a variable type as string, right, as number, and as boolean, and in that, in conjunction you can have like null type and undefined, right? So but you don't use null and undefined. So if you have a string, you can actually say that address is equal to null, right? You can say that, and address is equal to undefined. So you can say that. So in conjunction we use it. You also have any type, right? And we also have unknown type. But so in all of these address, in all of these types, you can only store, like these are the types which TypeScript give us by default, right? And you can only store one value in that. So for example, if you have a string type and if you define a variable which has a type of string, right, you can store only one value in that, right? So address is equal to hello, so now the value is hello. And if address is equal to hello2, right, so now address value is hello2, not hello and hello2, right? So if you want to do that, either you can define this thing as an array, or you can actually define this variable as an object. So object is basically in TypeScript or in JavaScript, it's set of properties, right? An object is a set of properties. So over here you can basically define an object. So for an object which has a property of message, right, it's a string, and basically another message, let's say message2, and type of string, right? So now you can have an address object which can have both of these messages incorporated into it, right? So you can have an address equals to message value is hello, right, and message2 value is hello2, right, whatever. So here address is your object. So set of properties, an object. So now if I want to print the value of console.log address, so its value will be message hello, message2 hello2. So an easy way to incorporate multiple properties. So a real world example can be an address which has like a street, right, a city, right, and a state and whatever. So you also have to pay attention. Now this is an error. This thing is an error because now address is of type an object which has street and city properties. It doesn't have message and message2 properties. So you have to basically change the properties of street and city. So this is how you define an object type. So now if I have to define this street and city as an object type, so let's, for example, I have a requirement that I have to have a variable, for example, let address 2, right, and I have a requirement this address 2 has to be again the type of this object. So object type is street city string. So if so now I have, what I have to do is I again have to copy and paste this thing, right? Now if this object type which has street and city as properties in it, I have to like have another variables like in another TypeScript files. I have to again copy and paste all of this. So now here comes the interfaces. So in interfaces, basically if you want to define your own type, right? Then you can do it with interfaces. So what I can do with this is, so I can actually define an interface and name it as address, and then I can just copy and paste this thing, right? So here I copy and pasted it, named as street as city, and now if I need to define a variable, let's say address of type address, then I just reference the address interface and I'm done. And it's just like that. You can define your own type. So the other quick thing, like for example, if you want to access the properties of an object, what you can access the properties by dot variable, dot operator, sorry. So address dot city will give you the value of the city, and address dot street will give you the value of street. Now the other thing is, for example, if you so this actually gives you, so the interface power is that it gives you the reusability of defining a type, right? You don't have to like write over and over again, and if you want to change something in that object type, you have to change it at one place. So for example, your requirement is that your like you don't have to pass the street, right? Your street is not required, let's say. So you can do it with an optional property. So if you do this, then you don't have to supply in street, and TypeScript will not complain about it. So this is mainly used, like a good use case of this can be in form, like you have an address form in which just for some reason you don't require a street but you require a city. So you can actually define a type like address in which street is not required but city is required. As simple as that. Alright, so now we will move on to our next thing, which is class. So classes in JavaScript are like not like actual classes. So if you are coming from an object oriented world, classes can be like a bit weird in JavaScript. So but in ES6 we have like an actual classes, so they are like pretty good now, in good shape, because you have to use like before protocol and all that stuff, fun stuff, which can be a bit confusing if you have an object oriented programming background. Alright, so moving on to our classes in TypeScript. So it is basically the same as you define a class in, say, Java. So for example, I have a class named as employee, right? And it has a property named as name, and property type is string, right? And if you want to pass in the values in this class, you have to have a constructor keyword, right? And now you can pass in the value of this name property. So this keyword, again, this means that means this employee class name is this property, and this name is whatever the value we are passing to this parameter, right? And just like you can actually define function, you can actually define method in the class, and when you define a method in the class, you don't have to specify function. So you can just say like greet, for example, it's a method, and you can define in the body of that method, you can write whatever you want, for example, start name, right? So in order to create the object of this employee class, you can just have an employee object, right, a variable, and just with the new keyword employee object, and then in the constructors over here, you will just pass in the employee name. Employee name can be anything, And then if you want to call the method inside the class, you can do this dot greet, and when you run it, it just prints out the name. So this is how class works. But for example, if you don't want to like in the constructor of this class, you just want to have a requirement that name will not always be there, so you can define an optional parameter over here too, and then you are able to not provide a name during the construction. So this can be a case, for example, during the construction I don't know what the name of this object is, but somewhere down the road I know the name, then I can do emp.name is equal to whatever the name is, right? So I can do it in this way too. So this is how you define a class in TypeScript, and how you define a method and a constructor, and how you create an object in TypeScript. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like this video, please don't forget to click on the like button. If you don't like this video, please mention why in the comment down below. Like, share and subscribe. Keep learning.